The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and soft jazz filled the air as the annual Miller Tech Gala began. Waiters floated through the crowd with silver trays, and executives gathered in clusters under the golden lights, sipping champagne and sharing investment updates. It was the company's 30th anniversary, a celebration of growth, innovation, and legacy. Joan Miller stood near the edge of the crowd, quietly observing. At 68, she had an elegance that didn't scream for attention but commanded quiet respect. Her navy blue dress was simple but dignified, her silver hair pinned neatly, and her hands clutched a vintage clutch that had once belonged to her mother. She had dressed for the occasion, even if she wasn't sure she belonged. To most in the room, she was just the mother of Andrew Miller, one of the company's senior VPs. A few knew her as the widow of Henry Miller, the man whose name still adorned the corporate walls of Miller Tech. But hardly anyone knew the truth. Joan wasn't just attending as a family member. She was the silent force behind it all. Joan owned 51% of Miller Tech. She had been there since day one, helping Henry build it from their cramped garage office into the multimillion-dollar enterprise it was today. But honoring Henry's dying wish, she had never told Andrew. "Let him earn his way, Joan," Henry had whispered with failing breath. "Don't give him shortcuts. He needs to stand on his own." And she had kept that promise. For 5 long years. Joan took a quiet sip of sparkling water and turned toward the crowd just in time to hear her daughter-in-law Vanessa laughing in a circle of board members. "Oh, this is Joan," Vanessa said with a brittle smile, her voice rising with performative cheer. "Andrew's mother. Well, let's just say she likes to drop by often. Our little freeloader." Joan's heart stopped for a second. Conversations in the circle stalled. A few executives exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to respond. "She's been staying with us a lot lately," Vanessa went on, her smile unwavering, tone coated in sugar and acid. "It's hard for her to be on her own since Henry passed. We do what we can." Joan felt her cheeks flush. She gripped her clutch a little tighter, not knowing whether to smile or vanish. And there, standing beside Vanessa, was Andrew, her son, her baby, the boy she had rocked to sleep after long nights running invoices and answering phones for Henry, the boy she had supported through college. The boy who now stood silently, offering only a tight-lipped smile. He didn't defend her. He didn't say a word. "I think I need the ladies' room," Joan murmured and excused herself. The bathroom was thankfully empty. She pressed trembling fingers against the cool marble counter and stared at her reflection. A woman with graying hair, tired eyes, kind hands that had once held an empire and now trembled like leaves. Was this what she had become to them? A burden? A punchline? She wasn't angry. Not yet. What she felt was something deeper, something that clutched at her bones and whispered, "You've let this go on too long." Joan remembered the early days, the grit and grind of startup life. She'd worked side by side with Henry, ordering parts, managing clients, even learning to debug code to help the engineers. They'd mortgaged their first home to fund their dream. They'd built Miller Tech together. She wasn't just a bystander. She was the foundation. And no one in that ballroom, not even her own son, knew it. Back at the party, Joan re-entered just as Vanessa raised her glass. "To legacies," she toasted. "And the future of Miller Tech." Laughter, clinks of crystal, and applause followed. Joan stood at the edge, a ghost in the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of the company her husband had left behind. She turned to leave. She didn't belong here, not like this. Outside, the night air was crisp. Her taxi driver raised an eyebrow when she asked to be taken home early. "Big party?" he asked. "Yes," she replied softly. "Very big." That night, Joan couldn't sleep. She sat in her modest living room, looking at old photo albums. There was Henry, grinning in a flannel shirt with a soldering iron in hand. There was young Andrew crawling under his father's desk, clutching a toy robot. So much of their lives had been poured into that company. Joan remembered bringing hot tea to late-night engineers, organizing the first benefit gala when the company turned 5, and writing personal notes to investors who had believed in them. They called her a freeloader now. The next morning, she called James Adler, the family's longtime lawyer. "James," she said, "I think it's time we had a meeting." About the shares? He asked, already knowing. Yes, she replied. And the board. And the future of this company. She paused. And maybe a bit about Vanessa, too. He chuckled softly. I've been waiting for this call, Joan. As they met over coffee that afternoon, Joan laid out everything. Her promise to Henry, the years of silence, the growing disrespect, the humiliation. James leaned back in his chair. Legally, you're the majority shareholder. You could walk into that boardroom tomorrow and take control. You don't even need Andrew's permission. I know, Joan said, stirring her tea. But I don't want war. I want respect. And I want my son to open his eyes. Then what's your move? She smiled quietly. It starts with the truth. And that was the moment everything began to change. No more hiding. No more shrinking to make others comfortable. It was time Joan Miller stepped back into the light. Long before Miller Tech was a billion-dollar powerhouse, it was an idea scribbled on napkins over midnight coffee in a cramped kitchen. Joan and Henry Miller weren't tech geniuses, they were dreamers with grit. Henry brought the engineering. Joan brought the operations, and together they built something enduring. They mortgaged their home, dipped into Joan's teaching pension, and worked side by side for decades. Joan handled payroll, contracts, even cleaned the floors when funds ran low. There was no role beneath her when it came to their dream. When Henry was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, everything slowed. The man who had designed servers and systems now needed help remembering simple things. Joan took care of him at home, where he wanted to stay, and in those final weeks he made one last request. Don't tell Andrew, Henry whispered, his voice a rasp in the quiet hospital room. Let him earn his place. I want him to lead one day, but with respect, not entitlement. Joan nodded, tears in her eyes. But what about the shares? They're yours, Henry said. You always made the business work. You held us together. But please let him rise on his own. After Henry's funeral, Joan followed his wishes. She quietly assumed full control of their shares, now totaling 58% of the company. She appointed a discreet financial advisor and voted through a proxy named Harold Whitman at board meetings. Not a soul outside her legal team knew that the quiet widow in the third row of the gala ballroom actually owned the company Vanessa so casually dismissed her from. She moved back into their modest home, ignored her lavish inheritance, and let Andrew rise. And rise he did. Over the next 5 years, Andrew became the face of Miller Tech. He started as a mid-level product manager and earned each promotion on merit, his father's drive flowing through him. Joan cheered quietly from the sidelines. Vanessa, though, was different. From the start, she eyed Joan with cool politeness. Joan, always in modest clothing, never fit into Vanessa's designer lace world of curated perfection. Vanessa made comments about Joan's old-fashioned lifestyle and frequently forgot to include her in family plans. Joan tried to understand, to give grace. But the gala humiliation had been the final straw. Now, back in her living room after that night, Joan sat staring at Henry's photo. I honored your promise, Henry, she whispered. But Vanessa's made this personal. The next morning, Joan called her financial advisor and lawyer. It's time, she said. Let's bring Harold Whitman back to the board table. And this time, let's shake the room. She wasn't out for revenge. She didn't want to embarrass Andrew or destroy Vanessa. What Joan wanted was simple, dignity. She'd worked too hard to be treated like disposable family furniture. If they thought she was a relic of the past, they were about to learn who really built their foundation. The days following the gala were marked by a growing chill between Joan and her son Andrew. He hadn't returned her calls after that night, and when he did finally respond to her message, it was brief. Just been swamped, Mom. Big pitch coming up. She sensed the strain in his voice, but more than that, she sensed something deeper, distance carefully cultivated by someone else. Joan had experienced loss before. Her husband, her parents. But this new kind of loss, the slow erasure from her son's life, was a grief unlike any other. First, she tried to reason it away. Maybe Andrew truly was overwhelmed. Maybe the gala had been a blip, a bad night compounded by stress. But then came the canceled lunch dates, the ignored text messages, the voicemail that went 3 days without reply, and Vanessa's silence, deafening. What Joan didn't yet realize was that Vanessa had wasted no time capitalizing on the aftermath of the gala. The moment they returned home, she painted Joan as an emotional liability, someone who didn't understand boundaries and couldn't let go. She's still clinging to the company like it's hers, Vanessa said, slipping into bed beside Andrew with mock concern. It's not healthy. For her or us. Andrew, tired and distracted, barely protested. She was embarrassed. That's all. Vanessa pressed further. I get it. She's grieving. But it's been over 5 years. And now, executives are starting to talk. Your mother showing up at these events. Lingering around the office like she's still part of it. It's not a good look, Andrew. Not for someone about to be promoted to COO. There it was. The word.
Promotion.
Andrew's breath caught slightly. That position had been his dream since joining Miller Tech. He'd worked overtime, sacrificed vacations, and led 3 key projects to get this far. I'm not saying you should cut her out, Vanessa continued smoothly. I'm just saying maybe it's time we help her settle somewhere more appropriate. That community we looked at, Rose Haven? It's beautiful. Quiet. She'd be cared for, not alone in that old house. Andrew's silence wasn't consent, but it wasn't protest either. And Vanessa knew that was enough. By the end of the week, Joan received a formal invitation to tour Rose Haven. The envelope came with Miller Tech branding, a subtle humiliation that made her blood boil. Tucked inside was a brochure highlighting independent living with dignified support. And a handwritten note. Mom, I think you'd really like this place. Let's go together next week. Love, Andrew. The words pierced deeper than any insult Vanessa had flung at the gala. So this is how it starts, Joan thought. The rebranding of my usefulness into burden. The soft push toward invisibility. She tucked the invitation into her desk drawer, next to her wedding ring and Henry's old fountain pen. For a moment, she was tempted to rip it in half. But Henry's voice echoed gently in her memory. Joan, never act out of anger. Observe. Then act when it counts. At Miller Tech headquarters, Joan's name was rarely spoken aloud, but her influence remained silently present in board reports, shareholder memos, and quarterly projections. Through her proxy, a trusted friend named Linda Boyd, she stayed informed on all major decisions. Vanessa had never questioned the name. Linda was just another silent shareholder on the roster. Unremarkable. Invisible. Exactly how Joan intended it for now. From Linda's reports, Joan learned that Andrew's rise within the company had been meteoric, but not undeserved. He was competent, innovative, and deeply respected. But he was also increasingly dependent on Vanessa's networking circles, connections that served both their ambitions. The hardest part wasn't Vanessa's scheming. It was Andrew's silence. The boy she once rocked to sleep during late-night thunderstorms. The young man who had hugged her tightly at Henry's funeral, vowing to protect her always. That son was now too blinded by corporate ambition and marital loyalty to see what he was complicit in. One rainy afternoon, Joan drove to the Miller Tech campus under the guise of returning a visitor badge. She knew Andrew wouldn't be there. It was Vanessa she hoped to observe. She sat quietly in the cafe across the street, watching as Vanessa arrived in a sleek silver car, heels clicking across the pavement like punctuation marks of power. Joan sipped her coffee and remembered when that same parking lot had been gravel, and she and Henry had celebrated their first software sale with vending machine sodas. How far we've come, she thought. And how far some people are willing to forget. Joan watched as Vanessa stepped into the executive elevator, flanked by 2 board members. Not employees. Not assistants. Executives. Why was Vanessa, who held no official title, being included in closed-door meetings? It was becoming clear. Vanessa wasn't just angling for Andrew's promotion. She was positioning herself as a shadow strategist. Someone who wanted not just influence through marriage, but control through proximity to power. And Andrew? He was letting it happen. Joan finished her coffee, left a generous tip, and returned home with one thought crystallizing. It was no longer enough to observe. It was time to act. That evening Joan made 2 calls. The first was to Linda Boyd. We need to start preparing for a shift in leadership. Quietly, Joan said. Linda didn't ask questions. Understood. What's the timeline? Soon. But not yet. I want to give Andrew a chance to step up. The second call was to James Whitman, a former corporate investigator and close friend of Henry's. He had once helped root out a mole leaking code to a competitor. Joan explained her concerns about Vanessa's increasing access and influence at Miller Tech. I need eyes and ears inside. Discreetly, she said. James hesitated. Are you sure, Joan? This could get messy. I'm already in the middle of a mess, she said quietly. Now I just need to see who's holding the mop and who's spilling the water. Joan Miller stood in the dim hallway outside Andrew's office, frozen. Through the cracked door. She had overheard something she was never meant to hear. As soon as the restructure's approved, we can move forward with the offshore licensing deal, Vanessa whispered to someone on speakerphone. Joan won't be a problem. Andrews finally agreed to suggest assisted living. She won't even be in the picture. Joan's heart clenched. It wasn't just personal disregard now, it was business. Vanessa wasn't merely trying to erase her from the family. She was actively working to reshape the company Joan had built with her late husband, Henry. And Andrew, her son, was complicit. She backed away from the door, the carpet muffling her retreat, and walked straight to the elevator without looking back. Her hands trembled, but her spine straightened with every floor that passed. She knew what had to be done. That night, Joan unlocked the heavy walnut cabinet in her study, the one that held her corporate records, dusty binders of quarterly reports, and Henry's old fountain pen still capped and used. She pulled out the legal documents that confirmed her ownership. 52% of Miller Tech, distributed quietly to her after Henry's death as per his will. No one had questioned it. Her name was nowhere near the day-to-day operations. She had honored his wish to let Andrew rise on his own, but honoring Henry's memory shouldn't mean becoming invisible. Not when the company and her dignity were at stake. She called Margaret Hines the next morning. Margaret had been Henry's trusted assistant for years, and now managed a small legal consultancy. I need someone to attend board meetings on my behalf, Joan said. Quietly, under an alias. I need to watch what's happening. Within a week, the papers were in place. Ms. J. registering Joan's presence through encrypted Zoom calls and occasionally in person with a hired representative when necessary. At the next quarterly board meeting, Vanessa was radiant, acting as if she already owned the place. Andrew flanked her like a polished extension of her ambition, not a son concerned with his mother's well-being. Joan watched silently through her secure video feed, taking in every inflection, every exchange. Vanessa proposed modernization initiatives for Miller Tech, plans that involved restructuring long-standing departments, selling off certain legacy assets, and pushing aggressive global expansion. Joan knew the language well. It was corporate sleight of hand. This wasn't growth. It was a takeover in disguise. Over the following months, Joan continued gathering. She reviewed internal memos, watched archived board recordings, and consulted with Margaret weekly. She even reconnected with Peter Langston, Henry's former CFO, now retired but still sharp and fiercely loyal. With his help, Joan traced Vanessa's proposals to shell companies tied to a global consultancy with a history of asset stripping. It was more than betrayal. It was sabotage wrapped in strategy. And Andrew? He was drifting. Joan could see it in his eyes, tired, conflicted, losing himself. In his emails to her, short, polite, and increasingly rare, he always cited being busy, never acknowledging her questions about family dinners or weekends. Vanessa, meanwhile, sent nothing but passive-aggressive reminders about real estate flyers and better environments for retirees. One Friday, Joan slipped into a Miller Tech building disguised in neutral slacks, a blazer, and a wig styled into a severe bob. With her glasses and a forged ID, no one looked twice as she entered the R&D department. She wanted to walk the floor, to see if the innovation spirit Henry had cultivated still lingered. What she saw instead were stressed employees, hushed conversations, and tension. "They're gutting us," whispered a young engineer to a colleague as Joan passed. "They're cutting projects that aren't profit-aligned, even if they're game-changing." Back home that evening, Joan sat with her old journal, flipping through yellowing pages filled with ideas, timelines, sketches Henry had drawn of Miller Tech's first product line. She stopped on a page dated 1987. Vision isn't quarterly, it's generational. The words echoed. That night, she finalized her plan with Margaret and Peter. I'll give them one last chance, she said quietly. Andrew, to see who his wife really is, to remember who I am. And if not, you'll take back everything, Peter finished. Joan nodded. The woman Vanessa called a freeloader was ready to reclaim her empire. Not with fury, but with precision. The boardroom at MillerTech was unusually tense that morning. The agenda had been marked confidential, and the presence of security guards at the building's entrance only heightened the unease among the executives. Vanessa, dressed in her usual sleek confidence, occupied her seat at the table with Ethan Lynn seated 2 chairs down, scrolling casually through his phone. Andrew looked pale, his eyes darting between the room and the door like he expected something, or someone, to burst in. Joan Miller walked in alone. She wore a tailored navy suit, her silver hair styled into a smooth chignon. There was no hesitation in her step as she crossed the room and sat at the head of the table, a seat no one had ever seen her in. For a moment, no one recognized her. Then Andrew's eyes widened in disbelief. Vanessa's jaw dropped. Good morning, Joan said, her voice firm, deliberate. My name is Joan Miller. And contrary to what many of you believe, I'm not just Andrew's mother or Vanessa's unfortunate houseguest. I am the majority shareholder of MillerTech. The room fell into stunned silence. Joan continued. My late husband Henry Miller and I co-founded this company. Before his passing, he asked me to remain in the background, to give our son the opportunity to earn his position on merit. I honored that promise for nearly a decade, but recent events have forced my hand. She opened the leather folder she carried and began distributing documents. What you're seeing are emails, financial reports, and correspondence gathered over the past several months. Evidence of an internal effort to manipulate company policy and shift financial assets through an unauthorized partnership with Lynn Strategies, Ethan Lynn's firm. All eyes turned to Ethan, who stiffened. These transactions were routed under the guise of an Asia-Pacific expansion strategy, Joan explained. But the data shows that Ethan's company would have gained substantial control over our intellectual property and operations abroad. All under a deal negotiated by Vanessa Westbrook, my daughter-in-law. Vanessa's voice cracked the silence. This is absurd. You can't just walk in here and make baseless accusations. You're not even on the board. Joan locked eyes with her. Correction. I've attended every board meeting for the past 2 years under the proxy name J. Morgan. Miss Miller, as listed in your minutes, you voted alongside me more times than you realized. Vanessa's face drained of color. And as the majority shareholder, I have full voting rights and veto power, Joan said, which I am now exercising to reject the Asia-Pacific proposal and launch an internal ethics investigation into all current consulting agreements. The boardroom erupted into a flurry of voices, some shocked, some skeptical, and others clearly relieved. A few executives pulled out their phones, whispering into them or reading through Joan's documents with furrowed brows. Ethan stood, adjusting his cufflinks. You can't just cancel a contract mid-negotiation. That's breach of agreement. Joan replied calmly. The agreement was signed under false pretenses. Your partnership was never approved through proper channels. You'll hear from our legal team. Andrew finally found his voice. Why? Why didn't you tell me any of this? She turned to him, her expression softening but her tone resolute. Because I wanted you to succeed on your own. Your father believed you could lead, but he feared giving you too much too soon. I upheld his belief. But silence is no longer strength when it leads to harm. Vanessa's voice trembled. You're destroying your own family for power.
No.
Joan said. You did that when you tried to dismantle the company that Henry and I built. You manipulated my son, alienated me from my grandchildren, and tried to cast me off like refuse. This isn't revenge. It's responsibility. Board Chairman Davis finally spoke. Mrs. Miller, your claims are serious. If the evidence holds, we're looking at multiple breaches of fiduciary duty. They will hold, Joan said. And I expect full transparency and cooperation from the board moving forward. Ethan gathered his things. This is far from over. Joan responded evenly. I agree. It's just beginning. He left without another word, brushing past the now silent board members. Vanessa, still frozen in her seat, suddenly turned to Andrew. Say something. Defend us. Andrew looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. Us? He asked quietly. I don't think there's an us anymore, Vanessa. You crossed a line. Vanessa stood up sharply, grabbing her purse. You're weak. Both of you. And then she too stormed out. The silence that followed was suffocating, until Davis stood. Mrs. Miller, thank you for your candor. We'll proceed with your recommendations. If you're willing, we'd appreciate your leadership moving forward. Joan gave a slight nod. I intend to stay involved. Not to control but to protect. Miller Tech deserves better. And so does my family. Andrew remained seated, stunned, watching as his mother stood and slowly gathered her things. Mom, he finally said. I didn't know. I didn't see it. I let her turn me against you. She looked at him with the eyes of a mother who had carried him through childhood, through grief, and now through betrayal. We all see what we want to see when we're afraid, Andrew. But now it's time to open our eyes. The boardroom was still echoing with murmurs as executives filed out, shocked by the revelation that Joan Miller, dismissed by many as a passive widow, was in fact the majority shareholder and co-founder of Miller Tech. But for Andrew, her son, the shock cut deeper than surprise. It was personal. He stood frozen, unable to move, his face pale under the harsh lights. Joan didn't approach him right away. She allowed him space, knowing the truth needed time to settle before words could bridge the chasm between them. I don't understand, Andrew finally said, his voice low and trembling. All these years, why didn't you tell me? Joan's gaze was soft but steady. Because your father and I wanted you to make your own way. We built this company for our family's future. But we never wanted it to become your crutch. Your father believed in your potential, Andrew. So did I. Andrew let out a breath like a slow leak from a deflating tire. But Vanessa, she said, she made me think. He stopped himself, his shoulders slumping. She made you think I was a burden, Joan said gently. I know. His eyes snapped up to meet hers. You knew? Joan nodded. More than you think. I heard the whispers. I saw how she kept me at a distance. How you started to pull away. Andrew ran a hand through his hair. A nervous habit he'd had since he was a child. Why didn't you say anything? Because love, Joan replied, sometimes waits. And I was waiting for you to see things for yourself. He sank into the nearest chair. And Vanessa? The deals with Ethan Lynn. Joan's face hardened. I suspect there's more. What I revealed today is only the tip of what she was planning. Ethan's firm stood to gain millions from a rushed overseas expansion that would have jeopardized the company. Andrew stared at the polished boardroom table, eyes glazed with realization. She said it was for our future, that we had to act fast or lose our edge. She was acting for herself, Joan replied. And for Ethan. Not for you, and certainly not for this company. Silence hung between them. Then in a smaller voice Andrew asked, Do you think she ever really loved me? Joan hesitated. She had no desire to wound him further. But honesty had been too long delayed in their family. I think she loved what you could become, not who you are. Andrew looked away. I should have seen it. She was clever, Joan said. Manipulative, yes. But very good at what she does. I don't blame you for being blinded. I blame her for doing it deliberately. He nodded slowly, as if swallowing a bitter pill. And you've been coming to board meetings? Watching me work. Every quarter, Joan said. As Mr. Gregory, my proxy. I watched with pride as you moved up the ranks. Not because you were my son, but because you earned it. Andrew's lip twitched, halfway between a smile and a grimace. Guess the joke's on me, huh? No, Joan said. The joke was on them. The ones who underestimated me. Who thought I was invisible. She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. And you're not the enemy here. You're my son. And I still believe in you. His hand covered hers. I don't deserve that. Not after how I treated you. You were under her influence. And I kept too many secrets. We both made mistakes. He shook his head. But you did it out of love. Vanessa did it out of greed. A long pause settled between them. What happens next? Andrew asked. I take a more public role, Joan replied. No more hiding. I'll oversee the board. And we'll begin reviewing past contracts, especially those signed during Vanessa's influence. And me? That's your decision, Joan said. If you want to continue here, you'll have to earn it. As you already have. But this time, you'll do it knowing the full truth. I want that, Andrew said without hesitation. I want to be part of rebuilding what matters. Not just for the company but for us. Joan smiled, and for the first time in years it reached her eyes. Later that evening, they sat in Joan's modest living room. A place Vanessa had often mocked for its lack of grandeur. But to Andrew it now felt like home. Joan poured him a cup of chamomile tea, Henry's favorite, and handed it over without fanfare. You remember when your father taught you to solder your first circuit board? Andrew laughed softly. Yeah. I burned my thumb and cried for 2 hours. He said you showed grit, even then. Joan said, her voice warm. That's what we hoped this company would inspire in you, grit, not entitlement. Andrew took a sip of tea, then looked at his mother. I want to know everything. About how you and Dad started it. What it took. The risks. The decisions. And I want to tell you, Joan said. All of it. From the garage days to our first failed pitch to the miracle of our first funding. For the first time in years, they talked not as strangers burdened by silence, but as family reknitting what had unraveled. Trust, once broken, wasn't easily restored, but it had begun. By the end of the evening, Andrew stood and hugged Joan tightly, holding on a moment longer than necessary. Thank you for waiting for me, he said softly. I never stopped, Joan whispered. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Inside, a new beginning had taken root. One built not on secrecy or resentment, but on the quiet strength of truth, love, and second chances. The boardroom at MillerTech had never felt so familiar, and yet so different. For decades, Joan Miller had stayed in the shadows, abiding by a promise made to her late husband, Henry. A promise meant to give their son, Andrew, a chance to forge his own path, unencumbered by legacy. But today, she walked through those glass doors not as a silent widow, but as a leader reclaiming her place. Since revealing her identity at the last board meeting and exposing Vanessa's collusion with Ethan Lynn, Joan had been quietly restoring stability. The board had voted unanimously to remove Vanessa from all consultative roles, and Ethan's company was blacklisted from any future dealings. But the public didn't know the full story yet. A week later, Joan scheduled a press conference at the company's headquarters. The media, curious about the sudden change in leadership and Vanessa's disappearance from public relations campaigns, gathered in full force. Joan stepped onto the podium wearing a navy blue pantsuit, her gray hair pinned back, a quiet smile on her face. The crowd hushed. My name is Joan Miller, she began. I am the co-founder and majority shareholder of MillerTech, a company I built alongside my late husband Henry from the ground up. Cameras flashed. Journalists whispered in surprise. For years, I chose to remain behind the scenes out of respect for my husband's wishes. We wanted our son, Andrew, to rise through his own merit, not through nepotism. And he did. He became an outstanding leader and contributor to this company. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But silence is not always golden. In honoring one promise, I nearly broke another. My promise to myself to protect the legacy Henry and I built. The room was still as she continued. Recent internal issues have required me to step forward and lead once again. I want to assure all employees, shareholders, and clients that MillerTech remains committed to its founding values: integrity, innovation, and inclusion. The press conference was a turning point. Joan's face appeared on the front page of tech journals and national news outlets the next day. Headlines read, Hidden Founder Steps into the Spotlight, and Joan Miller reclaims MillerTech. Back at home, Joan sipped her coffee while watching the coverage. The quiet clink of the spoon in her mug was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Andrew. Hi, Mom, he said, a sheepish smile on his face. She stepped aside, gesturing him in. They sat in the living room, where Henry's favorite armchair still stood in the corner. and a photo of the early Miller Tech days hung above the fireplace. "I saw the press conference," Andrew said softly. "You were incredible." Joan smiled gently. "Thank you. I was nervous." "You didn't seem it." There was a pause, the kind that comes between two people carrying years of unspoken words. "I owe you an apology," Andrew began. "For not seeing what Vanessa was doing, for not standing up for you." Joan reached across and took his hand. "We all want to believe the best in the people we love. I understand. And I should have told you the truth sooner. I didn't trust you with it, not because you weren't capable, but because I was afraid of how it might change you." He nodded, swallowing hard. "It means the world to me that you still believe in me." "I always have," she said. "But now it's time we walk this journey together." Over the following months, Joan and Andrew worked side by side. Joan restructured the leadership team, promoting from within, rewarding loyalty and vision. She brought back a few retired veterans who had built the company's core divisions, creating mentorship programs for younger staff. Andrew led product innovation, focusing on ethical technology and sustainability. Joan even launched a new initiative, the Miller Legacy Lab, dedicated to supporting startups led by women over 50. "Wisdom is an asset," she said at its launch event. "And experience deserves investment." Employees began to whisper her name with respect, not as a shadowy figure behind the curtain, but as a woman who had lived through betrayal and loss and still stood tall, offering leadership and compassion in equal measure. Andrew, too, began to find his footing again. Without Vanessa's constant pressure, he reconnected with old friends and began therapy to understand why he had allowed himself to be manipulated for so long. One evening, after a company dinner, he pulled Joan aside. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said. A few weeks later, he introduced her to a kind-hearted woman named Dana, a high school counselor with a passion for community work. Joan saw the difference immediately. Dana didn't treat Andrew like a trophy or a stepping stone. She saw him the way Joan had always seen Henry. As spring turned to summer, Miller Tech celebrated its 40th anniversary. Joan stood on stage at the gala, Andrew and Dana by her side, employees cheering. "This company started with 2 desks in a garage," she said. "But what truly built Miller Tech was love between partners, between parents and their child, and now, between a company and the people it serves." She looked at Andrew. "I made a promise to your father, and I've made mistakes in keeping it. But today I make a new promise. To never again shrink in the name of humility, to never again be silenced by loyalty, and to ensure this legacy is protected for generations." The applause was thunderous. Afterward, Joan returned to her garden, where the hydrangeas Henry had planted bloomed in shades of blue and purple. She sat on the bench beneath the old oak and watched the stars come out. It was quiet here. The kind of quiet filled not with loneliness but with peace. Vanessa had tried to diminish her, reduce her to a stereotype. But Joan had always been more than what others assumed. A partner, a founder, a mother, a leader. Now everyone knew. And most importantly, Joan knew it herself. Have you ever been underestimated by those closest to you? Treated as if your value faded with age, or that your silence meant insignificance? Joan Miller's journey reminds us that quiet endurance does not equal weakness, and that wisdom accumulated over a lifetime is not only valid, but vital. Too often, society, and even our own families, forget the strength it takes to remain steady through hardship, the depth of knowledge behind a composed presence, and the legacy built not by loud voices, but by consistent hands. Joan honored her late husband's wishes, bore indignity with grace, and remained faithful to her values until it became clear that silence was no longer protection, but surrender. Her story is a powerful reminder. Dignity must be defended, legacy must be claimed, and self-worth must never be outsourced to the opinions of others. As older adults, many of us have walked long, complex paths. We've raised families, built careers, weathered storms, and yet, sometimes we're treated as if those contributions are relics of a forgotten era. But what if our most important chapters are still ahead? What if the quiet strength we've developed is the very foundation our families and communities now need? Joan's story challenges us to ask, are we living in the shadow of our past, or standing in the light of our full potential? It's never too late to reclaim your voice, to protect your values, and to write the legacy that truly reflects who you are.